Okay, we now welcome to the show. This is a huge moment for the show. One of our favourites, Dan Hannan, one of the engineers of Brexit. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
So let's talk about it. So you are in Australia with the IPA and the Menzies Research Centre, and you're also going to be giving the John Bonathan Lecture with the CIS. Now, you're here with a speech, Brexit, Democracy and the Future of Freedom. So I guess we'll start there. What do you make of where Brexit is at right now?
Well, big picture, we are becoming an independent country again, right? No state in the world ever got poorer as a result of becoming more independent and more democratic. So we shouldn't lose sight of the magnitude of what's happening. We have, I think, made a few mistakes over the last couple of years, and we've been in a weaker position since losing our parliamentary majority. So the short-term picture is less rosy than it might be. But I have no doubt that 10 years from now, people are going to look back and wonder what took us so long.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'll get into what is taking so long, because there is a lot of delays and there seems to be a new debate about what form Brexit should be taking right now. What do you put that down to?
Well, I mean, there's no secret about that. Anyone who doubted that there was such a thing as a British establishment over the last 2 years will have had any illusions dissolved. There's been a group of people in Parliament, in the media and in the civil service and in some big businesses who have simply not been prepared to accept the result. They've been prepared to work against it in collusion with overseas authorities. And this isn't a sort of conspiracy theory of mine. There are, every week you see all of these guys, the Nick Cleggs and the Michael Heseltines and the Tony Blairs going to Brussels, writing newspaper articles on the continent, basically saying, hang tough, don't concede anything. We might be able to capsize the whole process. So, of course, from the EU's point of view, why even engage in talks when you've got British Remainers doing your work for you and urging you to offer the worst possible deal in the hope that Britain will somehow drop the whole idea?
Absolutely.
So in light of that, what do you think the most likely outcome is? A softer Brexit even, or a no deal?
I'm all in favour of softer breakfasts as well. I mean, I think, well, put it like this. If the Remainer strategy is to try and get the worst possible deal in the hope that we will change our minds about Brexit, the danger is that they get the first part of what they want. I think it is now probably more likely than not that whatever deal is struck in Brussels will not get through the House of Commons. Particularly if we were to leave the EU but not recover control of our trade policy. That really would be the worst of all worlds. And that's what the Europhiles are now pushing, that we should stay in the European Union's customs union, which would mean that Brussels would control 100% of our trade policy with 0% input from us. It would mean that we wouldn't, we'd still have to, exclude Australian beef because it has the wrong hormones and all this kind of stuff. No other country would put itself in a position like that. The Norwegians, the Swiss, they're as close as you can be institutionally to the EU without joining, and yet no one in their countries is seriously arguing that you should join the customs union and not have your own trade deals with China and so on. I mean, it's a completely ridiculous position. So we're in this bizarre world where a group of British Remainers are now deliberately arguing for a worse deal than the EU gives any other neighbouring country. Of course, that is not a very strong position from which to go into the talks. That's why I say that short term, it could be looking rosier.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's talk about, because of the, you talk about how there are people who are trying to make sure that Brexit doesn't happen, and that's now starting to really culminate in the people's vote. And we saw the marches.
I mean, what was the last one? A penguin's vote?
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly. No, that was a people's mistake.
Yeah.
They all stuffed up. But anyway, so we were having a lot of fun on the show last week with London Mayor Sadiq Khan saying that there's nothing more democratic, nothing more British than trusting the people to have the final say on our future, which Pete and I, as you say,
great,
that already happened.
Let's agree with that, Sadiq. Yeah, perfect. Good. Glad we're all on the same page. I mean, this is the real paradox, right? How on earth can we take seriously calls for a second referendum from people who, by definition, do not accept the result of a referendum, right? I mean, this is the madness. Of what they're saying is, okay, we know we said this last time, but this time it really, really, really will be a final, deal that settles it once and for all. I mean, obviously, unless they vote wrong a second time, in which case then there really will be a I mean, come on, how many times? Best of 5, best of 7? Are we going to make it a regular test like the cricket? I mean, for goodness sake, everyone, particularly on the Remain side, everyone agreed last time that this was going to be it. This was going to be final.
So you think there's no chance of that happening?
I mean, you have to allow a possibility, but I wouldn't put it at more than about 10%. I think the likelier outcome, the more mainstream kind of Remain strategy is not to try and overturn Brexit altogether, but to try and ensure that if it has to happen, it happens without any of the advantages. In other words, that we leave, but stay in the customs union and continue to accept EU regulatory control. And that, I think, really would be worse than either staying or leaving, right? I mean, that would be staying subject to EU decisions, but losing our veto. And that, whether you voted Remain or leave, that's got to be worse than either a clean break or just having stayed where we were.
Yeah, absolutely. I kind of feel if there was a second referendum that there'd be, like, leave would win by an even bigger majority just through people who are like borderline stay or leave, just going, well, hang on, there's one side that's not even respecting the will of the people. Do you reckon that's anything to go about?
I think so, yes. You know, I mean, British people, like Australian people, have a certain bloody-mindedness. And, I mean, what do you do? If somebody asks you exactly the same question again, what do? You repeat yourself, but with added emphasis, don't you? I mean, that's what we all do. And I think that would be the case here.
Do you think, so even though all the frustrations that have happened with the Brexit vote and stuff, do you still feel optimistic, you know, thinking about all those British people reasserting their sovereignty and reasserting their rights? Like, that must still be a source of happiness.
Of course, yeah. I mean, it is the end of a weird aberration that for 40 years had us both giving up an element of our parliamentary democracy and our self-government, but also giving up an element of our global trading profile. I mean, you know, before we joined the EEC, as it then was, we were part of a diverse, pluralist global trading network of countries that were linked by language and law and kinship and loyalty, but that were incredibly diverse economically. There were agrarian economies, there were commodity-based economies, manufacturing countries, finance and services-based ones. It was a market that allowed you to swap on the back of differences. I'm not sure it ever really made sense for us to join, in those days, 6 other similar developed Western European economies. It certainly makes no sense today. We have moved so far beyond the world of the 70s when it, you know, refrigeration was expensive and freight costs were high and you needed to be part of a regional bloc. I mean, I was looking this up. I was looking at the early, never mind coming here by steamboat or sailboat, looking at what it was like to fly here in the early days of flights. Enoch Powell, the former Conservative MP, took up a post at Sydney University as the youngest professor anywhere in the Commonwealth at the time in 1938. He did 20 different flights between Crete and Indonesia, mainly on seaplanes. Right. And he noted that all but one of them were in British territory. That was a very different world. Okay. I flew to Perth on one uninterrupted flight. So the argument, the basic argument for the EU that we should abandon the community of free English-speaking nations on grounds of geographical proximity has just been completely overtaken by technology. Right? Geographical proximity doesn't matter anymore. What matters is cultural proximity. And the huge advantage we now have, the huge opportunity we have with Brexit, is to be able to create a nexus of trading countries which are united by a common approach to freedom and free markets. And, you know, where do you start that list? With the other common law Anglophone democracies, with Australia, New Zealand, US, Canada, Singapore, the countries that have that basic attitude to the rule of law and free markets that is friendly to trade and unfriendly to mercantilism.
Absolutely. I want to take you back to the actual day of the Brexit vote, if I could, because I remember because it started to come in the afternoon for us, and I remember one of the first things I saw was Nigel Farage saying, you know, oh, we tried our best, you know, probably not going to get the result we wanted today. When did you start to feel that Leave might actually win? Were you confident on the day? Or?
Yeah. I mean, I thought it could go both ways, but I got up quite early to get out the vote. I live in a little village on the Hampshire-Berkshire borders, and I voted myself, I guess, about 8 in the morning. British people, as you will have noticed, are generally very reserved and very good at avoiding eye contact. But that morning, my neighbours in the village were all making a point of catching my eye and smiling and giving me a little thumbs up. And that was when I began to think, things are turning out okay.
Right, very cool.
it was always going to be touch and go. I mean, it was always going to be a close result. The funny thing is, I think that a lot of Remainers never really believed the opinion polls. To be fair, it's always harder to imagine a change, right? It's always easier to imagine a continuation of the status quo than a new situation. So I think that the result was a real shock to a lot of people who'd voted Remain. They hadn't seen it coming, and there was a certain trauma. And that's created what is for me the single most regrettable thing about Brexit, which is the nastiness and incivility in public discourse over the last 2 years, which was curiously absent from the campaign itself. During the actual referendum campaign, people tended to have, of course, strong differences of opinion, but within the bounds of normal political courtesy, we would talk about trade and immigration and the money and so on. The culture war has come since the result, and I think as a consequence of it, and the breakings of friendships and the ad hominem attacks and so on, and it's a very ugly and un-British way of doing politics. And 2.5 years nearly on from the vote, there's no sign of it abating, which I think is really sad.
You wrote recently in your Washington Examiner piece about the growing tribalism in politics, about what you're talking about here. Why do you think that is, and why do you think that's a problem?
It's really a good question. Lots of brilliant behavioral psychologists have addressed it and not really come up with an answer. Part of it, I think, is lack of an external enemy. The mid to late 20th century for the West was an unusually homogenous time internally, and it was also, people are less tribal when they feel threatened from the outside. So as long as the Cold War was on, we felt we had something all in common with each other, and that weirdly stopped being true after 1989. Also, there was a homogeneity that came from everyone watching the same TV stations and so on, which isn't there anymore. But I think, in a way, we need to flip the question round. People are naturally quite tribal. It's a very human thing to judge an idea on the basis of whether you like the person advocating it rather than on the intrinsic merits of the idea.
Yeah.
We've had to train ourselves to do that. And I think we're now reverting to our earlier kind of natural partisanship, which is to say, well, if Tony Abbott says that, then I must be against it or whatever, and which is a very sad thing, because it undoes the whole basis of modern Enlightenment-based societies, which is the ability to train yourself to be empirical.
Yeah, something we've noticed about Australians since we started the podcast is that they'll wait until Pete and I weigh in on an issue, and then they'll figure out amongst themselves what to think about that. So
good.
I want to talk about that because we had this same conversation with Douglas Murray when he was on the show before. Do you think there's anything to I see this especially on Twitter is where people will just be as uncivil as they can, and I just think it's something as natural as you don't get to see the person's face scrunch up and be sad. You're just screaming at a phone that's and then you see the retweets come in. It's like almost rewarding.
Yes, but you're also seeing something else on Twitter, which is that people are only aiming their comments at their own tribe. So if somebody says, "I hate Douglas Murray," then that comment isn't aimed at Douglas Murray. That comment is aimed at all of the other lefties. It's a kind of sign of the shared tribalism. Look, we all hate Douglas Murray, but guess what? I'm in the inner sanctum of purity because I've used even more offensive language about him than you have. And so you get into this, weirdly, this competitive virtue signaling where the nastier you can be about your opponents, the more you've signaled to the people on your side that you're okay. And I'm afraid I can see that having happened on both sides of the Brexit vote. Which I think is a real pity, because there was a compromise to be had, and I took the view. I remember appearing on the BBC as the results came in. It was about 6 a.m. on the Friday morning when it was just clear that we'd won, and saying, look, 52-48 is narrow. We've got to make sure that we carry both sides with us, and that's going to mean that we keep elements of the existing arrangements, and it's going to be a gradual phased recovery of power and so on. There was no market for that compromise. Nobody on either side was remotely interested in trying to reach out and find a compromise because of this tribal virtue signaling. So instead of pushing, the logical thing for Remainers, you'd have thought after a result like that would have been to say, okay, it was a narrow outcome, we accept that we're leaving, but here are the bits that we really care about. Can we find a way of leaving that we can preserve these things, right? Instead of which they went crazily down this road of people's vote and second referendum, which, removed their voice from the conversation. But similarly, the response on the Leave side was kind of, I'm more Brexity than you, and it was as though, for 25 years, the basic Brexit position was common market, not common government. That we wanted to be kind of in a free trade agreement, not in a political union. Now that's become kind of soft Brexit, and not on the basis of any intrinsic merits of the idea, but just kind of, I'm more virile than you are because you're in favour of a Swiss type option, and I want no deal with them at all. Which is every bit as crazy in its tribalism as the second referendum movement. And I'm afraid it has made compromise impossible. And this is the curse of our age. This determination to speak only to your own side.
All right, Dan, we've got to get you over to the IPA's event, so thank you so much for coming on the Young IPA
Great
podcast.
pleasure, guys.
Really
Thank you so
appreciate
much.
it.